Hello, this is Miss Moreland. Welcome to 8.6, Choosing a Method. This is going to seem somewhat like a review because you've done a bunch of factoring and now you're going to be told, you're not going to be told what type of method to use like you have been before. You're going to need to decide. Okay, so first thing you want to do is look for a common monomial to factor out. This is the very first thing we did where we said, okay, I can factor out a 2x from both of these. Second, you're going to be factoring something of ax squared plus bx plus c. And third is the key, always check to see if your answer works out. Right, so first one I'm going to actually tell you. I'm going to tell you this one is factoring out the greatest common factor. So if I look at this, I can factor out a 4, so I'm left with 4. And I'm left with x squared minus 1. Now when I factor out the greatest common factor, this should look familiar to you, this x squared minus 1. This is not completely factored, and I hope you're thinking, so I have 4. X squared is x times x. Negative 1 is negative 1 times 1, so I can factor that further into x plus 1 times x minus 1. So now you're seeing that we can kind of start adding to these. So this first one is a great answer, but not completely factored. If you want to get full credit, you'd have to completely factor it. So this would be my final answer. Second method we learned was just the straight when x is 1. You make your diamonds. You want to multiply to 28. Add to 11, that's 7 and 4. So since it's just a 1 in front of the x squared, you know you're just going to need x and x. And you don't need to go through the grouping. You already have your factors of plus 7 and plus 4. If this weren't a 1 here, then you'd have to go through the factor by grouping, which we're going to see next. Okay, so we're going to start putting things together like I did on the first example. So you always want to check, like I said, to factor out a common monomial. Now it's not always going to be the case that you can, okay? And then you might get down to something that's x squared plus bx plus c. So this example 1, you could do this. You could say, okay, I'm going to multiply the first and the last. And 3 times 18 is, 3, 6, 4, I think that's 52. 36, no, it might be 54. Let's see, 18, 36, 30, I can't think today. It's 54. And I'm trying to multiply to 15. Now you're looking at this probably going, well, 54 is kind of a big number to work with. Let me rewrite that. So you're probably going, well, I don't know if this is the most effective method. Still would work. So 54, I think, is 9 and 6. And you could go through and split up your middle term into 9x and 6x. Last term could stay the same. First term could stay the same. And then you could go through your grouping. So I can pull out a 3x up here, so I'm left with x plus 3. I can pull out a 6 here, so I'm left with x plus 3. So my answer would be x plus 3. And again, the leftovers are 3x plus 6. Now, as we said at the very beginning, how do you know when something is completely factored? You have to check. X and 3 have nothing in common, but 3x and 6 do, so really you're pulling out a 3 here. So you're left with x plus 2. And this x plus 3 hasn't changed, so you can write it in the front or the back if you wanted. So this would be it completely factored. Now I'm going to show you a different method now. So if you want to pause the video and write this down and see, you should all be comfortable with factoring this method. This last step may not be at your comfort level but you're not going to see very many of these. Now I'm going to show you what you could have done at the very beginning to make this problem much easier. So what I could have said is, 3x, 15, and 8. They're all divisible by 3, so I'm going to go ahead and pull out a 3. So I'm left with 3 out front. I get x squared. 15 divided 3 is 5x. 18 divided 3 is 6. Now I just ignore the 3 and I'm just factoring the inside. So when I do that, I have a 1 in front of my x squared, so I'm trying to multiply to 6, add to 5. Those factors are 2 and 3. So this inside right here becomes x plus 2 x plus 3, that's what this whole inside becomes. And don't forget that I do have a 3 out front that I factored. And now I've gotten to that answer a much quicker way. So I want you to pause the video, and instead of doing the diamond and factoring by grouping, I want you to try to see if you can factor out what they have in common first, and then just do the quick way of factoring. So you could draw your x and multiply to a 56 and add to 10, but you're going to have trouble finding the factors. Instead, you could say, okay, 2x, 10x, and negative 28 all have a 2 in common. So I'm going to factor that out, and I'm left with x squared minus 5x minus 14. Now I'm just going to look at this inside portion and make my x for that. So I want to multiply to a negative 14, add to a negative 5, 7 and 2 multiply to a positive 14. I want to add to a negative, so the bigger factor needs to be made negative. So this whole inside part is equivalent to x minus 7, x plus 2. Notice the 2 just stays out front, and now I've got my final factored form here. Okay, now not all problems are going to be like that. There are going to be some where you get to and you go, 2x, 13, 15, they don't have anything in common, so I'm going to have to go back to my trusty x and say, all right, I want to multiply to 2 times 15, which is 30, and I want to add to 13. Factors are 10 and 3. That does not mean my final answer is going to be x plus 10 times x plus 3, because I have that 2 out front here. This 2 throws off everything. So instead I'm going to need to do the method of grouping. So I got 10x and 3x to split up my middle term. First term stays the same. Last term stays the same. And this one is going to take me a little longer than the other ones, but it still gets me to my final answer. So I can factor a 2x out, and I'm left with x plus 5. I can factor out a 3 from the second set, and I'm left with x plus 5. My parentheses match, so I take those out front. They're both gone now, and the leftovers get written in the next set, so my final answer is x plus 5 times 2x plus 3. So quickly, let's just glance through here. Sometimes you're going to factor something out and have to continue factor, and sometimes you won't. When you have a 1 in front, it's the easier one where you can just jump to your answer with x plus 7, x plus 4. Always check to see if you can make it easier by factoring something out. But if you can't, you can always go to your trusty diamond and do the factoring by grouping. So now they're going to be all mixed up, and you're going to need to see which method you need to use. So here's the first one. If I just give you this and say factor, you should be looking for first. It's got a 1 in front, so that's pretty easy, which means I can't factor anything out here. So I'm going to jump to my x and say, all right, I need to multiply to the last term, add to negative 11. So 33 and 10 doesn't work. You should be thinking 5 and 6. If I want to multiply to a positive but add to a negative, both my factors need to be negative. And since there's a 1 in front, I can jump down to my answer because I know that x and x gets me x squared. Negative 5 and negative 6. Multiply to 30, and you can just double check here. You get negative 5x, negative 6x. That adds to negative 11, so I've done my factoring correctly. That's probably one of the shorter problems. Ooh, I can't draw straight. Probably one of the shorter problems you're going to have to do. All right, so then I look at this one and I see 6x squared, an x to the 4th and an x to the 3rd. You should not be thinking x's. Don't think that. You only want an x squared as your biggest exponent for those. So what I'm going to see is that 6, 8, and 4 all have a 2 in common. And x squared, x to the 4th, and x to the 3rd, the smallest exponent on those x's is x squared. So that's what I'm going to factor out. So I'm basically dividing each one of these by 2x squared. So when I take 6 divide 2, I'm left with 3, and the x squareds are now gone. 8 divide 2 is 4, and I have an x to the 4th, but I'm taking away 2 of them, so I'm left with x squared. 4 divide 2 is 2. I have an x to the 3rd, divide x squared, so I'm just left with an x. And that would be my final answer on this one. There should be no more factoring involved. All right, now moving on to another method. This one again, if you see 2 terms and a plus sign, you should not be thinking, oh, that's a difference of 2 squares, because it's always got to be a negative if it's a difference of 2 squares. So this one, all you can do again is factor out the greatest common factor. They have a 7 in common, and they have an x squared in common. So you're left with 2x plus 3, and that would be your final answer for this one. It's done. Right, I want you to pause the video and see if you could come up with a method for this one and factor it completely. Right, so you should first look 2, 7, 15. Nothing in common, so that means I'm going to go to my trusty x. I want to multiply to 2 times negative 15, which is negative 30. I'm going to add to negative 7, so you should be thinking 3 and 10. The bigger one needs to be made negative if I want to add to a negative. And this is that little bit longer method, but very trustworthy for you. You're going to split up the middle term. Remember, I like to write the negative factor first because then I don't have to deal with that silly negative in the middle. I keep my first term the same, my last term the same, and then I do my grouping. So I'm going to factor out a 2x out of the first one, and I'm left with x minus 5. I'm going to factor out a 3. I'm left with x minus 5. Now my parentheses match. They're gone. The leftovers go in the next one, so you're left with 2x plus 3. And again, the third step is always to check. I haven't been doing a good job of checking. Please always check your answers when you get them. I'm just doing it for the sake of time. Right, so I don't think we need to go over this one as much because this one would just be a quick x problem. And I actually think we've done this one before. So let's move on to our last one, which is 2x squared minus 24x plus 64. Now, you first should check, okay, I have a 2, a 24, and a 64. You should be thinking, they all have a 2 in common. That's going to make my life easier if I factor out the 2. I'm left with x squared minus 12x, and half of 64 is 32. Now, I just look at the inside and I say, this is nice. There's a 1 in front, which makes my life easier. Go to your trusty x, trying to multiply to 32, add to a negative 12. 32 is a little tricky. You should be thinking 132, that's not going to work. 216, that's not going to work. Not divisible by 3. 4 and 8. That looks promising. Well, I want to multiply to a positive, add to a negative. Both my factors need to be negative. And again, since there's a 1 in front, we're ignoring this 2. We're just looking at the inside. Since there's a 1 in front, I can jump to my answer and write x minus 4. X minus 8, and then I just place that 2 out front, and I've got to my answer much quicker. If I were to multiply 2 and 64 and do it the long way, you're going to get some big numbers that you don't know how to deal with. Alright, so go ahead and try the on your own tonight. There's one of each type, I would say, on there, so make sure you get the correct ones down.